What I'm going to do is talk briefly, for me briefly, maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then followed by Rabbi Cooper and Markowitz. And hopefully there will be sufficient time in the program, which is not usual, but they've allowed sufficient time for questions for any of you who would like to ask. I get to introduce myself. I'm getting old now. I teach at Columbia University. I've spent most of the last 35 years of my life in the United States government, working in the national security area, first at the White House, at the National Security Council, later at the Department of Defense, and in the intelligence community. And I guess the last major full-time job I had was as the director of the Defense Research Projects Agency in the late 1980s, which comes up in the discussion here when we get to talking about the internet. In any event, I'll press on with this. What I'm going to talk about is slightly different than most of the talks that you're going to hear over the next few days. Most of the people here are actually going through much of the substance that has been in the media. I'm going to talk about the media of the current era and some other comments I've got to make about how this relates to anti-Semitism in the modern world. And I want to start out by talking for a couple of minutes about sort of what I call changing paradigms in media in the world. In ancient times, biblical times, which fortunately most of the people at this conference won't know more about than other conferences I talk about. What were we talking about in ancient days? We're talking about an oral tradition, because not many people in the world could read or write, sort of like Afghanistan today. There were very few texts, very few manuscripts. They were very costly, hard to do, and nobody read. And that was sort of it for most of recorded history. When we get to the Middle Ages, we have an expansion of written and printed matter, as we did have an expansion in literacy, and at least what was part of the modern world at that time. And I guess the first major change, or what Kuhn at Harvard would have called a structure or scientific revolution, was with the invention of movable type by Gutenberg in 1534, which greatly increased the ability to produce media, or printed media it was in that time. And there really wasn't much of a change for the next 300 years. Benjamin Franklin's printing press looked just about like Gutenberg's did. You know, like they crank at a sheet of paper, squish it with the hand gizmo. Out came a sheet of paper, and to those that could afford it and pay for it, maybe they read his paper, but that was about it for that period of history. The next era that came in was not until the sort of mid-19th century, and something I sort of came up with a term, the electronic era, basically came in with the invention of the telegraph by Samuel Morse, something that really did not catch on and proliferate until after the Civil War. The invention of telephone by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, which really did not proliferate until some years later. And then radio by Marconi, if you believe that version of history, or Tesla, if you believe that version of history, somewhat later on. But by and large, the history of the so-called electronic era is communications were largely a costly boutique item. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes is the subject of marginal economics, more than anti-Semitism per se, because it really is the driver in the modern world. The next era that I want to talk about is sort of the final one in the era we're living in now, which is very, very recent, and something we're terming here the internet era. It sort of started with something called the ARPANET, named after the Advanced Research Projects Agency, an agency of the United States Department of Defense. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that transitioned from a Defense Department project, the ARPANET, to the Internet in 1989, and then some of the things that came after that, like the web and the web browser. The other thing that took place, and I'll talk a bit about that, is a massive increase in bandwidth. What do I mean by bandwidth? The ability to communicate. things like fiber optic cables, advanced RF systems, and so forth. And the last piece of this that occurred about the same time is what I call digital everything. Everything you're doing in the world is digital now, and the era basically of free communication. So those are sort of four eras in media. I want to talk for a couple of minutes about what this digital revolution really is. And I want to talk about it in terms of three major things. At the last slide, if I get to this, I call the Holy Trinity. It gets a couple of laughs when I talk to Jewish audiences. The Trinity being technology, economics, and culture. Because it's not just a revolution in technology, it's a revolution in all three that have radically changed your lives, your children's lives, and even the lives of, elderly people like my 9-year-old Holocaust surviving mother-in-law who sits there with her computer and her email and her great-grandchildren's kids' images she gets. The real part about this that started was a radical change in the hardware. It's computers, it's communication devices, it's web-enabled devices, where we now have integrated computing and communications and displays. We got a new generation of stuff coming along every 18 months. And what we really get, if you look in terms of the dollars for people, is something I call the era of free hardware. On the communications side, we've had a revolution as well. We've got new ways to actually move information. Fiber optic cables are going all over the earth now. There are satellites that move data. We have DSL connections. Many of you have them to your home, your office. We've got what we call cheap bandwidth at the home and the office. It's really very, very inexpensive to connect to the world. We have a world in terms of the technology where we've gone to something called packet switching rather than line switching, which was the great contribution of the internet technology. And sort of the last piece of this world of digital everything is everything that you're dealing with, all of the media you're dealing with, basically are digital. It doesn't matter what it is. Documents, audio, video, games, everything now is digital, and it can be moved or put on the internet or transferred on the internet easily because it's digital. We don't have to do what in the old days was called an analog to digital conversion. Paper media are basically vanishing. Newspapers have gone out of existence as published paper media. I guess San Francisco doesn't even have a published paper anymore in paper copy. It's all on the internet. And a lot of it's a good thing. I mean, when I left the government the first time and moved to Los Angeles in 1974, I used to have to arm wrestle a bunch of Israeli immigrants for a copy of Haaretz. It showed up a week late. It cost $5. There was a lot of money to me then. It's great these days. Haaretz, I get online. It comes for nothing. I can see it at 2 in the morning, and it's in English, so I don't have to struggle with my terrible Hebrew. It's really a different world. And the world has transitioned in sort of every respect from electronic media to other systems. In the area of law, you can't even take a paper brief to the federal court. It has to be uploaded onto their site. Documents are now accepted as scans, emails, no longer the business of an original signature, wax seals, ribbons. It's a totally different world than we had just a couple of years ago. The one that is the real killer here, or the second one that's a big deal, and isn't often recognized, for those of you who have been in the finance area or studied economics, this is a world of marginal economics. Not only are the devices we're using getting cheaper and cheaper, I use the term, everything we get today is cheap crap from China. You can't buy anything made in this country anymore. Everything we get is very inexpensive. It comes from China or one of the Asian countries, comes off the internet, free shipping, no tax. What you're using today are no longer toys for the wealthy. The stuff you're using today are affordable for adults and children. I sometimes make the facetious remark that every kid over the age of 3.5 is walking around on with a cell phone or some sort of handheld device. It wasn't that way years ago. When cell phones were first introduced into this country a couple of years ago, not that many years ago, the number was 47 and 47. $47 a month, 47 cents a minute, plus long distance, plus roaming, blah, blah, blah. The average housewife in Encino is running up a $700 a month bill for her cell phone. It isn't that way anymore. What we have to understand is that the marginal costs of communications are fallen to zero. You're paying a fixed monthly rate often for the phone at the house, if you're an old person and still have one. Most people now have switched to cell phones for everything. I've got a cell phone account. There's 4 phones on the account. Myself, my wife, and a couple of our adult daughters who are still charging their phones to us. But I've got over 12,000 rolled over minutes. There are no marginal costs. You can talk forever on your cell phone and it doesn't cost another penny. Compare that to the mid-1930s. What was the cheapest phone call you could make from New York to Los Angeles? $3 a minute minimum, and that was real money then. So what phone calls did it? Hello, Dad died from home. Click. You can yak forever now, and it doesn't cost anything. The laws of marginal economics apply. There is an absolute massive increase in the amount of use of all systems. Cell phones, internet. When I first left the government, the cost of sending a telegram to Europe was 75 cents a word, and they charged you for the period. It was called a stop. And if you were lucky, it got there the next day, and maybe somebody delivered it. You can email the Bible overseas now for nothing. With a click of the mouse. It doesn't cost you anything. And if you want a phone overseas, it costs nothing. If you've got an iPhone 4 now, you can download the Skype app. You can call overseas, and you can talk forever for nothing. This is a radically different world. The other piece of the marginal economics is that the media are free or nearly free. Most of what you can get off the media doesn't cost anything. Memory now is actually charging some money, but it's a fabulous service. Most digital media, audio, video, are either free or very, very inexpensive. You want movies, $9 a month to Netflix, you can download anything they've got. The days of going to Blockbuster Video and spending real cash, long gone. And this is the first time in recorded history that media have become free. And when we invert this and we start to talk about the dissemination of materials, including things like anti-Semitic literature, anti-Semitic video, technology has become the great enabler, and the marginal economics have dictated what's going on. The last piece of this thing, based on the fact that the technology has so radically changed and the economics have changed, the culture we're living in has also changed. And it's not just business, it's not government, it's not just the legal system or the military or the medical profession, it's everything. It's adults at home, it's students and kids everywhere, it's things I don't even understand that I teach this stuff. Kids standing 5 meters away from another kid, sending them a text message. Why can't I talk to them for crying out loud? I don't get it. But it's the way it is right now. Those of you who are students at college, kids will never call home unless they need money. But they'll send email. Go figure, it's a different world. The internet and the other devices of the internet era have radically changed how people communicate and how they interact. Email and text messaging and cell phones and PDAs have become a way of life. It's a way they obtain media. It's a way they obtain entertainment. All the electronic exchanges have, in many cases, replaced personal interactions. I was mentioning to somebody the other day that I watched telephones come into widespread use in Israel. And as that happened, it no longer takes 7 years to actually get a phone in Israel. You can now go down to the kiosk and get them for a couple of shekels. But when phones were introduced into Israel later than they were in the United States, the telephone was used as a mechanism by which one arranged to have a meeting by which business was discussed. the business wasn't discussed on the telephone. It's not that way anymore. Business is transacted by telephone, business is transacted by email. It has become secondary to these personal meetings and interactions. The culture has changed. And the other stuff's gone crazy too. Social networking has now come to be a big thing. Facebook in the last couple of years has gone from a dorm room project at Harvard, that other place down the road, to 400 million accounts in almost, the blink of an eye. And then the other guys at Twitter and all this other stuff has come along. It's become a major factor in people's lives that didn't exist 2, 3, 4 years ago. Dating sites now lead all other methods by which young people get together and get married. And I got a report that the information I get from the intelligence community and my friends is that J-Date is a roaring success. My middle daughter found her fabulous husband on J-Date. It's happening all over the world. It's probably a good thing. We now have games and other new types of media, and we have websites of all kinds, shapes, and forms, from the very benign to the very deadly, including many of them that are anti-Semitic and are the hosts for anti-Semitism. And what I'm going to say a few things about that, but I'm going to actually leave the substance to my colleagues on the panel to actually, get into that in further detail. But, what does the internet and these technologies actually offer for anti-Semites? Very efficient and cost-effective communications, access to all sorts of media and information. It really is the biggest media revolution since Gutenberg and the invention of movable type in the 16th century. The cost of dissemination falls almost nothing. The ease is unprecedented. You don't have to go to the library. You don't have to travel anywhere. You can have the stuff in your own home. As a platform for propaganda, recruitment, everything else, anti-Semitism has become very, very inexpensive. It's possible to not only disseminate, it's possible to recruit not only people for anti-Semitism, but to Islamic terrorist organizations. It's possible to provide them with training, resources, and support. We've had anti-Semitic media through the ages. It's a tradition that goes back to early times, Greeks, Romans, and so forth. I've put a couple of things in here just so I don't have lots and lots of words. We started in the 16th century with pamphlets of Martin Luther and, all sorts of other bits and pieces that have appeared over time. One of the largest things that really has appeared in the whole world of anti-Semitism, if you look at it over the last few hundred years, are cartoons, and there's a gazillion of them available, so I won't put up all of them. Other symbols that we used before the internet era, things like clothing and badges. The last one is sort of the one that you see most commonly from the Third Reich. Just to give you a couple of ideas as to why this has happened and happened so quickly, I got an email the other day on a piece I'm working on this whole proliferation of secrets on the internet. One of the newspapers asked me, who was in charge? How did this happen? And I tried to tell him there wasn't anybody in charge. He doesn't get it. This whole business began, cybersys, as we call it in the net, as an experiment in the 1960s at the Department of Defense at the Advanced Research Projects Agency. It had nothing to do with email, and the web wasn't even part of the concept. The original network was 4 computers, one at UCLA, one at Stanford, one at Santa Barbara, Utah. Early on, the transition to the internet took place a few years later in 1989, with all deference to my dear friend Al Gore, who got a really, really bad rap on this thing as his colleague in this monstrosity. He did not invent the internet. What Senator Gore, then, who was chairman of the R&D subcommittee of the Senate Armed Services Committee, did do was introduce a bill into the Congress and the Senate, which gave me $250 million to make this happen. It was Gore's bill, and it was my signature that moved this money to make it happen, and he got a bad rap on that one. But my role in this could have been performed by a trained monkey with a pen. But he does deserve a great deal of credit in history for standing up and getting us a $250 million, and then a couple years later another $300 million, to actually transition this from an experiment in the Defense Department to something that's changed the world. And it could have been the best couple $100 million this government has ever spent, but in any event. What we've had since '89 is an absolute explosion of this technology around the world, and I can absolutely guarantee you, having sort of been there, that it was never expected. Nobody at DARPA, used to be ARPA, they keep changing it, or anyone else ever expected this to take place. You didn't have these slides, some of you want to look, it's just sort of traces some of the things that took place over the time, from an original doctoral dissertation, a RAND study in the early 60s, to some of the things that have come along in the 1980s. Just so you want to see how this thing started, the government asked for proposals from industry, and the request for the proposals on the left side. One company in the country actually responded, Multiranica Newman. For those of you who like history, IBM sent in a response to the government that said, this is too hard and it probably can't be done. The Digital Equipment Corporation sent in the same thing, this is too hard and it can't be done. And BB&N, who basically figured it out to begin with, sent in this document which said, we think it's really hard, maybe it can be done, but why don't you give us the money and we'll try. And that's how it sort of started out in the early days. What happened over the last, years, we started from 4 nodes on the entire network in 1969, which is not all that long ago, to today. We have no idea how many people are in there. Probably a couple of billion. We don't know. But it's come along. Why did things change like this? Well, a couple of reasons. All at the same time. There was a paradigm shift, Moore's Law. Very cheap, powerful integrated circuits. Moore, if you don't know Gordon Moore, he was the founder of Intel. He invented the integrated circuit. Packet switching, a much more efficient way of using circuits, digital everything I mentioned, and this idea of cheap communications. All 4 things at the same time brought about a revolution in the world. You don't want to know this one. For those of you who like little pictures, this was our first hard drive. It's this thing in the cabinet the young lady's looking at. It took up a chunk of a building. You probably got a 400 megabyte hard drive on your laptop because it's an old one and you didn't get a new one yet. But the world has changed. I've talked a little bit about what's going on in the world. One of the things that's been mentioned today, and it's probably not useful spending a huge amount of time repeating, is the huge amount of overlap between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel feelings. A massive proliferation of websites. Gabi Wyman in Haifa, who keeps track of these things at his center here, has got, give or take, 800 or so Islamic and Al-Qaeda websites, native languages and others. It is the medium for the modern era, and I think Rabbi Cooper's got a couple of things to say about that, so I'm going to leave that piece to him. One of the questions that comes up, because I'm more of a technologist than a biblical scholar, can we stop it, or should we? There are some First Amendment concerns in the U.S. The French tried blocking some stuff that didn't work real well. There's really some technical issues similar to blocking the porn sites. It's hard. Maybe you can stop some stuff in the short run. In the longer run, it's very, very hard. There's a lot of sites around, and I think Rabbi could talk a bit about that. There's an overlap in some of the areas between anti-Semitism and some of the other radical things we're seeing, particularly the animal rights terrorists, which has become a California problem. I have a sort of personal interest in that. The principal target of the eco-terrorists in the California area happens to be my wife. The people getting arrested are in front of my house. There are cop cars that sit there 24 hours a day. There are some of the demonstrators here. Then they firebombed our home twice in the last couple of years. So this whole idea of, people going after Jews, things they stand for, there's stuff on the internet talking about my wife as Hitler with a vagina. It's not a kind world, and the internet does promote a great deal of this. I've got lots of examples of what some of the sites look like, which I'll pass on for the time being. I want to make two other points before I yield the floor here about the internet era that go beyond the technology and the communications. There's a couple of things that have happened in the same period of time that have made the situation a whole lot worse. The first one has to do with what Dave Rappaport calls the fourth wave of terrorism. And he calls that the religious wave of terrorism and the rise of radical Islam. It really began in 1979 because of sort of the Iranian Revolution, the evolution of the Islamic secular state, a new Islamic century, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There are a lot of examples of Sunni Arab terrorist attacks. Probably one of the other things that had a huge impact was the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, which was the same year we gave away the ARPANET to become the Internet, where you had religion defeating a secular superpower, and the former Soviet Union lands with large Muslim populations becoming fertile fields for terrorists. The religious narrative, really political events, provided hope for the religious states. The Iranian Revolution showed they could defeat the Soviets. Islam was the heart of this wave, but there are others as well. The American role in the world changed to that of being the great Satan. The chief antagonist after the Soviet Union was now defeated. Jews are the driving force in American foreign policy, and the need to eliminate the American presence in the Arab world really raised its ugly head as anti-Semitism. The Quran readings have been covered at great length already today, and you know what they've had to say. The second piece of this is, apart from the Islamic Revolution, has been the spread of the Muslim world and the Muslim diasporas today, particularly in Europe. A short 2 million in Great Britain, where you've had 30 terrorist plots, 1,500 extremists under surveillance by MI5, 6 million in France, 3-point-some million in Germany, and so on, and well over 1 million in the United States. And these are old numbers that need to be updated, but the basic point is there has been a huge migration of Muslims to Europe and the United States, where they do form a bed and a core for both anti-Israel and anti-Semitic operations. There's been a huge change in the terrorist model. The 9/11 business is probably a thing of the past, and we're looking more on drawing on domestic Islamic populations. And they are doing their recruitment through the internet and other methods. And you're seeing, these were all taken in Europe. This is not in the Arab world. And I've got a couple of final thoughts before I turn it over to Rabbi Cooper. First, in the internet era, technologies are essentially key enablers. We have old and new media that are available at radically lower costs and provide widespread access. The other thing is, we live in a dynamic world. The pace of change is very rapid. It isn't going to stop, and we're going to see newer things as we go along, and they may be for the worse. As I was leaving the government at the time of Perestroika, I got asked to give a speech on the subject of personal communications in Moscow. So I'm giving this talk on personal communications in 1990, just as the internet was happening. And I was giving a talk, and part of the speech talking about something I called nomadic electronics. I said, in a few years, you're going to be walking around with a single device. It's going to be your telephone. It's going to be a connection to the internet. You're going to have music and video pictures on it. And they thought I was absolutely crazy. They were probably right, but it did come to pass that you're all walking around, well, you probably do, with a gizmo that's got all of this stuff on it, and it's part of your daily life. You have to remember that it's not just the technology, it's what I really call the Holy Trinity here. It is technology, it's economics, and it's a change in the culture. The second one I make, this rise of radical Islam and continued Israeli-Palestinian discord has been a cover for anti-Semitism of the worst kinds, and we saw a great deal of that this morning. And the pro-Palestinian media, which are not just the sort of wacko far-end stuff, you're seeing this in the mainstream media in Europe and the United States, are making problems a great deal worse. And this whole business of the spread of the diasporas of Muslims to the Europe and the United States, it's a fertile ground for terrorism, it's a fertile ground for anti-Semitism, and the problems are getting worse, and I think it's a trend that's going to continue. And at that point, thanks, I'm sort of done on the time I wanted, and now, if you've got questions, I'm happy to take them, but let's let the others do it, and then I'll sort of call on anybody who has questions about what I've said. The next thing I would like to do is to introduce Rabbi Cooper. It's a real pleasure that he's come to join us today, rather than just simply reading his background, which I don't intend to do at all. I met Rabbi Cooper probably 2 decades ago when he and his colleague, Rabbi Mar Heyer, were building the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. And Rabbi Cooper is not only a student of Torah, he's a student of technology. And what they did there was something that was earth-shaking and radical at that point in time. They created a center of scholarship and learning that was different than any other in the world. They not only had the Wiesenthal collection of archives, but they sent special technology, which is so commonplace today, but was earth-shaking and had to be created from scratch in those days, around the world and brought into the Wiesenthal Center the collections of all other facilities around the world, so that a scholar, a researcher, and even a member of the public could go into their center and see these archives electronically in real time, which had never been done anywhere that I knew of. And I thought that was a pretty radical thing at the time, and these guys historically hopefully will get great credit for what they accomplished, both in terms of making the world aware of anti-Semitism, as well as making the information available to sort of anybody who wants it. Rabbi?
This year, because you really have living history here about the entire dynamic of the internet, and not just the part that we're going to be speaking about today. And I feel very lucky to have Dr. Wagner at the front, and Mark, who I heard gave a fantastic presentation. We were together a week ago in Montreal about Iran. So I know that we'll be covering a lot of territory. I was really nervous about 2 things as I got up to speak here. One, you just saw. I may analyze the technology. I don't have a clue how any of this works.
So right money.
I'm very happy that the right people are here to help out. Secondly, I mean, who has the chutzpah to get up after Dr. Weiss's unbelievable presentation today? Its clarity, its courage, really remarkable. But she did get me thinking, of course, off topic. But I'd like to share the following true story that happened to me. It has nothing to do with the internet per se. One of the areas that falls to the Wiesenthal Center, because our international headquarters are on the Pacific, Asia-Pacific rim. We do a lot of work in Asia. I've been to Japan about 30 times, and very often we go there when we find one of the major publishing houses or TV networks doing something about the protocols and the elders of Zion. So the day came when it was Nikkei's opportunity to get the Wiesenthal Center treatment. If you ever look on TV, the stocks, basically Nikkei is the Wall Street Journal of Japan. Very respected, generally stays away from stuff like this. Anyway, they were in some indirect way, but a profound way, about to be involved with a new edition of the Protocols of Zion. We stopped it in the tracks. So part of the peace treaty that we do with Japanese corporations, and by the way, it works like a charm. Halavai, all the other places in the world would be so easy. We catch the company when they do this. They write a letter of apology, and part of the peace treaty is they have to invite over 2 or 3 people from the Wiesenthal Center. And their entire executive command, can be 150 people, have to take out an entire day not only listening to someone speaking in English, but then consecutively in Japanese, which means that by the time I finish my presentation, none of these people ever wants to see my face again. So it's a very effective countermeasure, low tech, but effective countermeasure in Japan among the elite on anti-Semitism. So at the end of my presentation was about the protocols, and I brought many original multilingual covers of the protocols that we have in our archives, and I gave a whole hour speech, and I thought it was rather well organized. And then at the end, for anybody who's ever done business in Japan, or has ever lectured in Japan, I did something that only an American would do, but I knew, as he said, that it was really just meant as a sort of an Americanism. I asked anyone if there was a question. And when you give a presentation in Japan, it's very rare that you're going to have an immediate reaction, because all interplays are sort of negotiated. They go back, they have a group discussion, and they come back to you. Much to my shock, the executive vice president of Nikkei got up and he said, "Yes, Rabbi Cooper, we have a question." Okay, what's the question? Well, first of all, thank you for coming and for telling us what the protocols are all about. We now understand that Jews do not go to their synagogue on the Sabbath and plot the economic downfall of Japan. We very much appreciate that. And we know that you don't go to synagogue in order to control the banks or the media. And I said, terrific, I think you've got a good synopsis of the points I wanted to make. What's your question? His question was, Rabbi, what do Jews do in synagogue? And from the time of that question, I pretty much have changed my entire job description, or more accurately, my approach to my job. And it's sort of, I felt very much connected to Professor YIISA's underlying point of her presentation is that we really have to figure out a way how to get out from under the automatic defensive posture. You know, we don't beat our spouses, and we don't do this, we don't do that. And here was at least one honest Japanese person who wanted to know, so what exactly do you people do in shul? Anyway, I thought that's something I would share with you. It's something that I carry with me each day in my work. Our first speaker, as actually the inventor of the internet, and someone who used up hundreds of millions of dollars of American taxpayers' funds along the way, and as you can see, enjoyed every moment doing it. I think he gave a very good context to the issue that we're looking at today. I come from a completely different perspective. When Rabbi Heyer, my mentor and boss and friend, went to see the late Simon Wiesenthal in 1977 in Vienna and asked for his good name, quoting Shlomo HaMelech, right? A name is more precious than oil. He said, what do you have in mind? If it's going to be a place where you only light yahrzeit candles twice a year, great idea, I'll give you a letter of support. It's not me. I'm an activist, so I expect that if you want my name, you guys are Americans, I'm European, I expect as part of this a new relationship that you have to be activists. And actually that conversation leads directly to these to our digital and terrorism hate project, which we founded back, I guess, in 1998. And in the early years, it was very sort of difficult to get the attention in a serious way of the media. A lot of folks didn't understand the technology, myself included, but by virtue of how we got there, we simply followed the rats, meaning we were following neo-Nazis. And you may recall that we once sent an Australian-Israeli journalist undercover inside the neo-Nazi movement in Germany for 6 months. You can imagine how thrilled the German intelligence and police services were to meet us in Berlin when we're giving them the results of our 6 months undercover Jewish guys undercover inside the country. But the most important piece that came out from all of that was the fact, they learned something and so did we, that the so-called lunatic fringe, this is before internet, they were all using computers. They were using computer technology when the local police in Germany and Austria had no clue what a keyboard was. And we saw from the earliest days of the internet, the first website, which is still around, it's called stormfront.org, back in 1995, the day of the Oklahoma City bombing. Today, we're looking at about over 12,500 problematic websites, news groups, and increasingly social media. And this is just one institution. The numbers, I'm sure, are way, way beyond that. And to sort of recapitulate, well, make one other basic point, and that is, we put out an annual report called Digital Terrorism and Hate. It's in a CD-ROM. For anyone who'd like a copy of the latest one, I happen to have a couple up here at the end of the session. Feel free to come down and pick up a copy. But the truth is, we're looking at two parallel phenomena. There's the world of hate online, which is bad enough, and most of my presentation will be about that today. Mark is going to cover in more detail the issue of terrorism. But there are two parallel planets, and our institutional approach as both an American-based NGO, my colleague Dr. Shimon Samuels, who's based in Paris, had a lot to do with our Yahoo intervention with the French going back many years ago. We're dealing in the US with First Amendment freedoms, freedom of speech. Canada has its own unique approach. And then when you go over to Europe, to Australasia, there's tremendously different dynamics afoot. But our basic approach institutionally is as follows. If there's a hate website, we try to go to the provider and we say to them, by the way, how many people here have ever read underneath, you can't raise your hand, underneath the gray button when you buy a new software or you sign on to a new service where it says, I agree? How many of you have ever read the entire document, the contract underneath? Amazing. This is one of the highest percentages. There are 5 people who raised their hand. I have never done so, but we have our senior researchers and other highly paid specialists who do. In other words, it's a contract. And we say to them, if you read your own boilerplate, normally, from our point of view, normally speaking, when you see the stuff, if we show it to you, this violates your own terms of usage, and we want you to throw them out. Now, does that eliminate that information or material from the internet? It does not. But overall, I think everyone agrees on all sides of this particular divide that trying to encourage good online citizenship is a very good thing, and occasionally it does throw a monkey wrench into bigots. When we're dealing with terrorism, it's a completely different issue. There, we're not so much concerned about eliminating that posting as to making sure that the appropriate police or intelligence service has seen the same thing, or at least has interpreted the same material that we have. So there, it's much more important to get that, to verify with the police agency that they've seen it than it is to remove the information. So, sorry for my French, but let's go right to Facebook. And I might as well show you the rest of these because they're all there. Okay. So, interesting thing happened. You know, when you have 400,000 members and 300,000 more people at Reason. No, I'm talking about us. Another 300,000 who are signed up for our so-called e-blasts. You get a lot of information coming your way. So what happened? One of our members told us blank Islam was no longer on Facebook, but all the other blanks, all the other attacks on the religions were. So I have to have my speaker from YU, and I wrote, I thought, a very clever letter. Congratulations, Facebook, you did the right thing. Now please take off the other ones. 2 weeks later, got back an email from the head Pupop subdivision who said, thank you very much for bringing this to our attention. We're going to correct the situation immediately. And they restored blank Islam. And by the way, this all happens in a much broader context, because one of the subtexts of at least my presentation today is that in the last year, our center has met probably with Facebook folks and actually trained some of the Facebook people about 5 or 6 times. They're no longer at 400 million mark. We think they've surpassed at least 500 million. And the problems with Facebook, of course, by the way, they wrote a great terms of usage. They sort of understood in theory what the problem was. No one ever anticipated that they would be where they're at today. And that's a big problem, not just in terms of hatred, which we'll show you in a little while, but also, especially in terms of terrorism. Well, by the way, why does Facebook allow these sites attacking religion? Because they consider it to be speech. They're freedom of speech. By the way, they also consider this stuff, Shoah denial, also to be a speech issue. I will say that when we were able to show them that the material was coming or validated by a government, in this case Iran, they did take off some of the stuff. So I would just start by saying that, let's say last Thursday we spent 5 hours at Yahoo. The average age of the people we met with, about a third, not half, but a third of my age. We've been with YouTube and Google, which is an interesting new world for Google, never was into content until recently. And I would just say that any of us who have any concerns in these areas, you can either send us the material or draw a straight line to these important social networking addresses, because that's where the action is at today. Increasingly, that's where hate and terror groups and their support systems are going to. And also, there's one other thing I want to get about social networking down, because I want to leave Mark the maximum time also, is that they are sort of disabling our whole numbering system. You know, the media, cites 20% spike in the number of hate postings. 15%, 20%, over 10,000, 12. Well, we live in a world today, as you know, when you had that beautiful counterattack on the flotilla from using humor, right, from Israel, Carol Glick, went over 1 million. So everything about these social networks are viral. That's the good news. Imagine again what the bad news is. So do you count every single one of those pages or repetitions as its own crime, or do you just do a singular one? It's rendering all this pretty good. Does anybody know what this is before I go into the details? It's been in the news. Actually, Yad Vashem, I believe, came out, and the Israeli government asked them to attack it. This is the digitizing of a Holocaust cartoon book that the Iranian government put out about 2 years ago. This just went up a couple of weeks ago. And you know, this is history of the world. If you look up at the visuals, one cartoon is worse than the next. You know, I'm here in the presence of Professor Deborah Lipstadt, one of our heroes. And she put everything on the line to fight this stuff and to defeat it. And it reminds me of something that Hillary Clinton said the other week at our meeting on anti-Semitism. She got it right. Is you think you have one part of this issue cornered, and before you turn around, it's morphed in a way so as to allow the Iranians to do this kind of stuff and to, in many ways, disable the anti-Nazi laws that Germany has had in effective use for decades. Dietlieb Felderer. Anybody know who Dietlieb Felderer is? Of course, but you don't. Yeah? Okay. Dietlieb Felderer did not wait for the internet to become a Jew hater. He goes all the way back. He actually spent time in jail for slandering Simon Wiesenthal. He is, along with, I guess, Ahmed Rami, who's an ex-Moroccan living in Sweden, the two most prolific Jew haters in Sweden. So 2 weeks ago, when we were at Google headquarters, and the lady in charge of YouTube content sat in, and she felt very comfortable that she had everything covered. Dietlieb Felderer, I'm not going to repeat what this says up here. It's pornography. Okay, he had on YouTube and Orkut, which is another associated social network site, 35 anti-Semitic blogs. Again, we don't have to go into details with this group of experts that are coming together, but obviously Shoah denial is the staple of anti-Semitism, and today we not only have Shoah denial, we have relativism, revisionism, inversion, you name it, and the internet, which is I think one of its greatest powers, really, is to incubate ideas. You know, you can have something on life support for a very long time, and maybe it was already in a dustbin of history. Bring it online, slap on a coat of paint, and find a catchy phrase, and you can be back in business. How many of you are familiar with this particular site? This is a YouTube site, and in some ways it's the most shocking. Anybody ever seen this before? Do you want to explain, Professor?
No, you go ahead.
So we have, maybe I'll show a few seconds, but you all know that the Nazis brought a team of, basically came to make a so-called documentary about the Jews in Terrorism to show the world how great Jews are being treated under the Nazi regime. It was so ludicrous that actually was never released. But now it serves as I don't know if we'll get the audio on this, but the audio happens to be off on here. But if you recall now some of the stuff, the horrors of that particular event, you know, showing the kids who are sitting in the audience with tables piled with food, all of those children never were able to eat anything there, taken out immediately to the trains and gas. So this particular piece of propaganda, Nazi-made propaganda, which never made the cut during World War II, is now, in fact, being used online to say, oh, the Jews say it was such a terrible time. Here's the historic footage taken by the Germans themselves. Now, this is very interesting, not only because of its ugliness, but because it's tied to a mainstream debate that's going on right now, right? Not just Lithuania, but other fairly well-known Europeans have backed an idea that the International Holocaust Memorial Day should be dropped. That's January 27th. And it should be combined with a singular Memorial Day for the victims of the Shoah as well as the victims of communism. So this is actually going on in real time. And surprise, surprise, you see the ugliness underneath it, which is again an attempt to sort of make its way into the mainstream. I don't even know what to say when I show you this stuff. So Norway, which you might not think is at the top or near the top of our problematic countries, actually is, unfortunately, in many ways, at the top. Knut Hamsun was, I think, the first Nobel Prize winner for literature in Norway. His 150th anniversary just came. The government spent a couple of $1 million to rehabilitate him. He actually, during World War II, gave Joseph Goebbels his Nobel Prize. He was so enamored with what the Germans were doing, didn't particularly like the United States. Wasn't necessarily an anti-Semite, but this again reflects rediscovering Knut Hamsun. This reflects an ongoing attempt to redefine memory and to try to minimize, marginalize, and deny what happened in the Shoah. Pin the tail on the Jew, Facebook page, and here we go with protocols, Egypt. How many of you have heard about this? Right, well, that's the Israeli diplomat, poor guy, they don't pay you enough. But again, here's a perfect example of how old hatred, updated to the 21st century, in many ways incubated online, so it's kept alive, and then when the appropriate time came, to try to move it forward. Everybody knows what the Israeli military hospital and 200 plus people, what they were able to achieve. Even the BBC, CNN, everybody saw what it was, the whole world saw it. However, there were some anti-Semites who saw another wonderful opportunity, which was, what's the real reason the Jews are there? Answer, to continue their whole approach of stealing human organs and making a business out of it. We can sort of snigger at it, laugh at it, dismiss it, picked up by the Iranian news media, and as we know also earlier, just a few months before, we had the front page story in a leading Swedish newspaper in which suddenly the government of Sweden overruled its own ambassador to Israel and withdrew its condemnation of that hate thing. So what used to be a kind of, if you will, a flat or one-dimensional promotion of an idea will now make its way to YouTube. Just quickly, this was the guy T. West who did it. Some of the classical Jew hatreds making their way back. This is from Palestinians. You'll excuse me if I skip here. I actually have a rap, anti-Semitic rap. I don't think we need to see that. Now, here's a very interesting thing also, and that's trying to control or redirect or reformulate news. This gentleman, John Patrick Bedell, in case you forgot, he's the man who came down the subway at the Pentagon, and he wounded 2 security guards and he was killed. There was absolutely no indication that this gentleman had anything whatsoever to do with any anti-Semitic views or whatever. That didn't stop the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists online from taking ownership, if you will, of that deed. And then, of course, you had James von Braun. If you remember, he died in prison recently at the age of 89. Here again is a classic kind of, I think, internet story. This is a man who not only kept his hate alive over decades, for him, the internet provided the ultimate validation of his views. This guy was very hyperactive online, and eventually he decided that he wanted to go out and act out on his hatred, and he was the one who attacked and murdered the security guard at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And of course, when he died, he became a big hero to the online bigots. This is actually from Canada. It's really interesting. It's a great website. They actually have most of the top headlines of the day. They just make one little change. Whatever bad happened, they just insert that the Jews did it. And it looks like a pretty good news source at first look. How many of you heard about the Beat the Jew? It actually started with Beat Brunette. There was a cartoon series.
I wanted to download it and bring it, but they pulled it.
Yeah, there was a what's it called? Something Park, South Park. Actually had this thing they said, go out and beat all the brunettes. And unfortunately, in the US and Canada, there were numerous examples where people followed up and did it. So here you had a couple of very clever seniors at a San Diego, California high school, 2 weeks before graduation. Not the riffraff of the class, the top of the class, in which they posted to Facebook, Beat the Jew. There were 3 or 4 Jews in the class. For those kids, you know, it should have been the highlight of their young lives. It was a complete ruination of it. And it goes into some detail about how to do it, and got some local media out of it, etc. One of the things that we're all focused on, anyone who's looking at the internet, are conspiracy theories. The internet was made for conspiracy theories and vice versa, and you can imagine which ones. And guess who co-opted it? The more serious people, the terrorists. We've had now the so-called, the individual, the shooter at down at Fort Hood. You've got Jihad Jane and all the rest of these individuals. Here you have Hezbollah working out. Boycott, I don't know if you've seen this one. That's an American site. And something that we'll probably be taking up next year in more detail. Something that has not gotten enough attention. I want to make it very clear that I don't consider to be the website, I don't consider websites of mainline Protestant religions to be hate websites. They are not. But when they pick up and embrace things called like the Palestinian Christian Kairos document, which denies the rights of the Jewish people to their own state, and calls for an embrace of supersessionism, of a theology that basically said today's Jews have no connection to 3,000 years ago. We have no legitimate past. When the Torah talks today, when we read the Torah today, when it talks about Israel, it's the new Israel. The only time the old Israel, meaning us, kick into to this new narrative is when the prophets talk about curses. When it talks about curses, we can have ownership. When it talks about anything to do with the Holy Land, the Jews have no connection. You now see in the various biennial and annual meetings of major mainline Protestant denominations a seepage of this theological hatred into their mainstream. The internet plays an important role, not only in the promotion, but by the way, an important role for us to see what their tactics are.
So you claim Palestine as a hate?
I'm going to stop here because I myself want to hear a lot more about the terrorism aspect from my colleague Mark. But I will say again, if you see something that you feel needs to be dealt with, my first suggestion, urging, is draw a straight line to the provider. If you get an answer, that's the best. Drawing a straight line. Secondly, please empower your children and grandchildren. They already know about this stuff. But actually, it would help if you actually spoke with them. If you're having a problem with a particular provider, you can throw us an email. But if you see something, or your kids or grandchildren see something, we have a simple email. It's the letter I report at YIISA.com. Please send it along to our attention, and we'll try our best to do our share.
Thank you, Rabbi Cooper. As always, you've done a marvelous job, and I was particularly thrilled to see the extent to which you've woven the social networking material into your presentation. Mark,
or taking advantage of the mentally incapable and clearly in other cases of children. U.S. government needs to go on the offense in order to discredit the jihadist narrative by making these examples available through the Muslim world. In other cases, they can use things like search engine optimization. This is when you do a Google search, and I'm sure many of you have Googled your own name and found really interesting things associated with that. I know I have. Well, search engine optimization allows you to influence the top 10 searches that are connected to any keyword search. So if you put in Osama bin Laden in an Arabic site, more often than not, words will come up like hero and martyr, great defender of the Muslim faith. Well, with search engine optimization, you can actually change that listing so that the top 10 that come out actually reflect who this man is. This is something that, again, it's a simple tool that's used in the corporate sector all the time. It's very helpful for shaping the narrative. I'm going to end by highlighting some of the challenges. Clearly, First Amendment issues, legal restrictions that exist out there, outdated laws. There still is an education deficit, despite the great work that Rabbi Cooper is doing in Memory and Palestinian Media Watch. There is still a reluctance in this country to go after media outlets, as there is a reluctance to go after charities, and terrorist organizations are exploiting this by using seemingly innocuous institutions to operationalize their terrorist activities. Thank you.
Media, I guess San Francisco doesn't even have a published paper anymore in paper copy. It's all on the internet. And a lot of it's a good thing. I mean, when I left the government the first time and moved to Los Angeles in 1974, I used to have to arm wrestle a bunch of Israeli immigrants for a copy of Haaretz. It showed up a week late. It cost $5. There was a lot of money to me then. It's great these days. Haaretz, I get online. It comes for nothing. I can see it at 2 in the morning, and it's in English, so I don't have to struggle with my terrible Hebrew. It's really a different world. And the world has transitioned in sort of every respect from electronic media to other systems. In the area of law, you can't even take a paper brief to the federal court. It has to be uploaded onto their site. Documents are now accepted as scans, emails, no longer the business of an original signature, wax seals, ribbons. It's a totally different world than we had just a couple of years ago. The one that is the real killer here, or the second one that's a big deal, and isn't often recognized, for those of you who have been in the finance area or studied economics, this is a world of marginal economics. Not only are the devices we're using getting cheaper and cheaper, I use the term, everything we get today is cheap crap from China. You can't buy anything made in this country anymore. Everything we get is very inexpensive. It comes from China or one of the Asian countries, comes off the internet, free shipping, no tax. What you're using today are no longer toys for the wealthy. The stuff you're using today are affordable for adults and children. I sometimes make the facetious remark that every kid over the age of 3.5 is walking around on with a cell phone or some sort of handheld device. It wasn't that way years ago. When cell phones were first introduced into this country a couple of years ago, not that many years ago, the number was 47 and 47. $47 a month, 47 cents a minute, plus long distance, plus roaming, blah, blah, blah. The average housewife in Encino is running up a $700 a month bill for her cell phone. It isn't that way anymore. What we have to understand is that the marginal costs of communications are fallen to zero. You're paying a fixed monthly rate often for the phone at the house, if you're an old person and still have one. Most people now have switched to cell phones for everything. I've got a cell phone account. There's 4 phones on the account. Myself, my wife, and a couple of our adult daughters who are still charging their phones to us. But I've got over 12,000 rolled over minutes. There are no marginal costs. You can talk forever on your cell phone and it doesn't cost another penny. Compare that to the mid-1930s. What was the cheapest phone call you could make from New York to Los Angeles? $3 a minute minimum, and that was real money then. So what phone calls did it? Hello, Dad died from home. Click. You can yak forever now and it doesn't cost anything. The laws of marginal economics apply. There is an absolute massive increase in the amount of use of all systems. Cell phones, internet. When I first left the government, the cost of sending a telegram to Europe was 75 cents a word, and they charged you for the period. It was called a stop. And if you were lucky, you got there the next day, and maybe somebody delivered it. You can email the Bible overseas now for nothing with a click of the mouse. It doesn't cost you anything. And if you want a phone overseas, it costs nothing. If you've got an iPhone 4 now, you can download the Skype app. You can call overseas, and you can talk forever for nothing. This is a radically different world. The other piece of the marginal economics is that the media are free or nearly free. Most of what you can get off the media doesn't cost anything. Memory now is actually charging some money, but it's a fabulous service. Most digital media, audio, video, are either free or very, very inexpensive. You want movies, $9 a month to Netflix, you can download anything they've got. The days of going to Blockbuster Video and spending real cash, long gone. And this is the first time in recorded history that media have become free. And when we invert this and we start to talk about the dissemination of materials, including things like anti-Semitic literature, anti-Semitic video, technology has become the great enabler, and the marginal economics have dictated what's going on. The last piece of this thing, based on the fact that the technology has so radically changed and the economics have changed, the culture we're living in media wasn't that time. And there really wasn't much of a change for the next 300 years. Benjamin Franklin's printing press looked just about like Gutenberg's did. Like they crank at a sheet of paper, squish it with the hand gizmo. Out came a sheet of paper, and to those that could afford it and pay for it, maybe they read his paper, but that was about it for that period of history. The next era that came in was not until the sort of mid-19th century, and something I sort of came up with a term, the electronic era, basically came in with the invention of the telegraph by Samuel Morse, something that really did not catch on and proliferate until after the Civil War. The invention of telephone by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, which really did not proliferate until some years later. And then radio by Marconi, if you believe that version of history, or Tesla, if you believe that version of history, somewhat later on. But by and large, the history of the so-called electronic era is communications were largely a costly boutique item. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes is the subject of marginal economics, more than anti-Semitism per se, because it really is the driver in the modern world. The next era that I want to talk about is sort of the final one in the era we're living in now, which is very, very recent, and something we're terming here the Internet era. It sort of started with something called the ARPANET, named after the Advanced Research Projects Agency, an agency of the United States Department of Defense. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that transitioned from a Defense Department project, the ARPANET, to the Internet in 1989, and then some of the things that came after that, like the web and the web browser. The other thing that took place, and I'll talk a bit about that, is a massive increase in bandwidth. What do I mean by bandwidth? The ability to communicate. Things like fiber optic cables, advanced RF systems, and so forth. And the last piece of this that occurred about the same time is what I call digital everything. Everything you're doing in the world is digital now, and the era basically of free communication. So those are sort of four eras in media. I want to talk for a couple of minutes about what this digital revolution really is. And I want to talk about it in terms of three major things. At the last slide, if I get to this, I call the Holy Trinity. It gets a couple of laughs when I talk to Jewish audiences. The Trinity being technology, economics, and culture. Because it's not just a revolution in technology, it's a revolution in all three that have radically changed your lives, your children's lives, and even the lives of, elderly people like my 9-year-old Holocaust surviving mother-in-law who sits there with her computer and her email and her great-grandchildren's kids' images she gets. The real part about this that started was a radical change in the hardware. It's computers, it's communication devices, it's web-enabled devices, where we now have integrated computing and communications and displays. We've got a new generation of stuff coming along every 18 months. And what we really get, if you look in terms of the dollars for people, is something I call the era of free hardware. On the communications side, we've had a revolution as well. We've got new ways to actually move information. Fiber optic cables are going all over the earth now. There are satellites that move data. We have DSL connections. Many of you have them to your home, your office. We've got what we call cheap bandwidth at the home and the office. It's really very, very inexpensive to connect to the world. We have a world in terms of the technology where we've gone to something called packet switching rather than line switching, which is the great contribution of the internet technology. And sort of the last piece of this world of digital everything is everything that you're dealing with, all of the media you're dealing with, basically are digital. It doesn't matter what it is. Documents, audio, video, games, everything now is digital, and it can be moved or put on the internet or transferred on the internet easily because it's digital. We don't have to do what in the old days was called an analog to digital conversion. Paper media are basically vanishing. Newspapers have gone out of existence as published paper. What I'm going to do is talk briefly, for me briefly, maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then followed by Rabbi Cooper and Markowitz. And hopefully there will be sufficient time in the program, which is not usual, but they've allowed sufficient time for questions for any of you who would like to ask. I get to introduce myself. I'm getting old now. I teach at Columbia University. I've spent most of the last 35 years of my life in the United States government, working in the national security area, first at the White House, at the National Security Council, later at the Department of Defense, and in the intelligence community. And I guess the last major full-time job I had was as the director of the Defense Research Projects Agency in the late 1980s, which comes up in the discussion here when we get to talking about the internet. In any event, I'll press on with this. What I'm going to talk about is slightly different than most of the talks that you're going to hear over the next few days. Most of the people here are actually going through much of the substance that has been in the media. I'm going to talk about the media of the current era and some other comments I've got to make about how this relates to anti-Semitism in the modern world. And I want to start out by talking for a couple of minutes about sort of what I call changing paradigms in media in the world. In ancient times, biblical times, which fortunately most of the people at this conference won't know more about than other conferences I talk about, what were we talking about in ancient days? We're talking about an oral tradition, because not many people in the world could read or write, sort of like Afghanistan today. There were very few texts, very few manuscripts. They were very costly, hard to do, and nobody read. and that was sort of it for most of recorded history. When we get to the Middle Ages, we have an expansion of written and printed matter, as we did have an expansion in literacy of at least what was part of the modern world at that time. And I guess the first major change, or what Kuhn at Harvard would have called a structure or scientific revolution, was with the invention of movable type by Gutenberg in 1534, which greatly increased the ability to produce media or printed